Somalia is on the brink of its worst famine in half a century as drought intensifies and global food prices soar. This leaving hundreds of thousands of people at risk of dying from starvation. The United Nations has warned that parts of the country will be hit by famine in the coming weeks. And the projection is that it will be more severe than 2011, when famine killed more than 250,000 people there. About half of them were children. Now, more than $2.2 billion is needed to provide food, water, shelter, health and sanitation and other support to drought-hit communities. But Somalia has only received about half of that from foreign donors. Aid workers say that the threshold for famine had already been passed in some areas, calling for an immediate official declaration which would draw global attention to the disaster, mobilize much needed foreign aid and save lives. Well, for the latest, we're now joined by the Chief of Communications at Unicef Somalia, Victor Chinyama. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you again. Sadly, circumstances seem to be deteriorating there.
It is a difficult time for Somalia, and as we have been saying in the past, the situation can only get worse. And we see this every day that we travel to communities that have been affected by the drought. I am just astounded by how many more people we find each time we travel. These are people that have been displaced by the drought, have been forced to leave their homes in search of help, and the numbers just keep increasing by the day.
Why hasn't a famine been declared? What seems to be the requirements? Because that would change the game significantly if it was called a famine, wouldn't it?
Well, it is a very technical process that the experts go through. They look at the data that is before them, and they make a determination on whether that data actually fulfills the criteria that have been set for a famine. The criteria being the number of children with acute malnutrition, the number of children, number of people dying rather, as well as the number of households that have been affected by food shortages. So as we speak, that data is being analyzed because, if you recall, the warning was issued in August. So after that, teams fanned out to collect the data. They have since come back with information that is now being analyzed, and we are waiting to hear what the decision will be.
Are people dying in the meantime?
Again, it's so difficult to say. Until we look at the data, it's difficult to say to what extent people are dying, but we certainly know from the limited data that we have, and this we collect from the nutrition treatment centers, that up to this point, more than 900 children have died of acute malnutrition. But that is only a tip of the iceberg. That we know because we have heard testimonies of so many people who have lost their children along the way to these IDP sites, and most of these deaths are simply never recorded.
I mean, this is an emergency then. Why then aren't things being done with much more rapid force, urgency and action?
Well, first of all, funding was difficult to come by in the early stages, right? So, and the world was preoccupied by many crises, including Ukraine. And even though the government declared a disaster from as far back as November last year, and we had been warning about the situation in Somalia, it was only recently, I would say in the last 3 to 4 months, that the international community was able to respond, to step up and provide the funding that was needed for humanitarian organizations like mine, UNICEF and the broader UN, to be able to respond to the situation. So in the recent past, there has been a massive scale up of support provided to the Somali people. And we will know whether that has been able to make a difference once the results of the data that I referred to earlier are released in the next couple of days.
Somalia is also a country that is dealing with insecurity. Does that make access to people in need all the more difficult? In which case, some of this data,
of course, it does.
Makes it problematic. As you say, yeah, carry on.
Yes, of course it does. It really does make it difficult for us to access certain areas that, as you say, are completely out of bounds because of insecurity. But we are not sitting back and waiting. We are constantly looking for different ways of reaching people that are living in those areas. But at the same time, the people themselves are also moving. They are not waiting for help to reach them. They are moving to areas where they will receive help. And that is why, in large part, we are seeing such a huge increase in the numbers of people displaced. These are people that have come from inaccessible areas and have then moved on towards some of the major towns of Somalia where they are able to receive help.
Al-Shabaab, they don't hide in corners. I mean, they're quite visible. International organizations such as yours, are you not able to engage with Al-Shabaab leadership to allow for humanitarian access?
That is an issue, unfortunately, that I'm not able to comment on. I think what we focus on, of course, are the areas where we are able to reach people, and we need to be able to increase the amount of support that we can provide to these people. But again, as I said, also finding different ways and means for us to be able to reach people that are in areas that are inaccessible. And as you know, in the recent past, there are areas that we previously would never have been able to reach, but have since been recovered. And the UN, together with the humanitarian community, are now moving into those areas to provide the much needed humanitarian aid.
How widespread is this problem in Somalia, this drought, this humanitarian crisis that's unfolding?
So Somalia has a total of 74 districts. We actually estimated that 66 of the 74 districts were affected by the drought. However, not all of them were affected to the same degree. And so we, as the humanitarian community, were able to prioritize some of the most affected districts where we are seeing large numbers of people, but also where the needs were much greater. And so our response has prioritized these districts to make sure that every individual, every child in those areas has been reached, because we feel that people who are in the greatest need, in the greatest danger, have the greatest risk of actually dying. And we should be able to prioritize them, reach them as quickly as we can with safe water, with nutrition treatments, as well as with emergency help, and of course with food, and so that they can then at least minimize some of the risks that these communities are facing in Somalia at the moment.
Security to one side, because that's probably a political issue that needs to be dealt with. Climate change is probably the main driver of what we're seeing weather-wise. Is there a solution long-term to deal with this region so that we don't have this story playing out year after year, time and time again?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the message of the COP27 that just ended, which is, you know, countries like Somalia that contribute the least to climate change actually suffer the most. And therefore, the international community needs to be looking at ways and means of compensating for the loss that these countries are suffering, but also looking at how families that are at risk of climate change can be made to be more resilient. And right here in Somalia, there are examples where this is happening. For example, ensuring that, and many of these, by the way, are livestock farmers, ensuring that their livestock is restocked, that they have better farming methods, that they are provided with climate resilient water. That means water that is available 24/7. But also in the long term, that girls can go to school, especially, and that children have access to nutrition that can safeguard them and their families, of course, when crises of this nature hit. There are no easy answers here. There are no short-term answers here. But without sort of having a look at what is needed to be done in the long term, I'm afraid we'll keep coming back to the same issues of one crisis after the other, and we'll be caught up in responding to the immediate needs at the expense of looking at the humanitarian solutions that are required.
How much is required to deal with the now emergency, and what's the deficit?
So I can only speak for my organization, right, as UNICEF, and I know that there are needs that Somalia as a nation has put across, that the UN has put across, but for UNICEF, at the moment, we are looking at in excess of $200 million to respond to the current humanitarian needs. But when you look at the overall requirements for the long-term resilience work that is needed to help countries like Somalia to cope with this climate change, we're looking at something in the order of $500 million to address some of the challenges that Somalia faces as a result of climate change, and these are cyclical challenges that are happening ever more frequently now.
And sadly, in real terms, it's not a lot of money, given some of the budgets that are being spent on arms and other things in other parts of the world. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed for that update. And let's hope that those that can help are hearing the message and might move to do something. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Okay, so a crisis unfolding in Somalia, drought, insecurity, all compounded, and people facing starvation, children already dying, we believe, as a result of the humanitarian crisis there.